Hi there, this video is all about what goes on in Chinese manufacturing companies. Now, I've worked with China manufacturing for over 12 years. I've visited probably 8 or 9 times, and believe me, I have seen it all. Now, in this video, I'm going to pull back the curtain. I'm going to reveal some shocking things that you will want to know about if you're considering manufacturing a product in China. So buckle up and get ready for the ride. Do make sure you watch right until the end of this video, as the most shocking tale has been reserved until the very end, and I'm also going to share 3 top tips for avoiding the major pitfalls if you do have to manufacture in China. Now, the first shocking truth about a lot of Chinese manufacturers is the lack of transparency. In fact, I visited some manufacturers only to get to the end of the tour and basically say, "Is this your only factory?" And at that point they tend to look a little bit sheepish, and then you suddenly find out that they've shown you a show factory and the real factory is actually a few miles down the road, or sometimes a few hours down the road, and the conditions are inevitably far worse. It's much less well lit, much less well ventilated, and it is nothing like the working conditions that you've just seen. Another shocking truth about a lot of Chinese manufacturers is at the end of the day, they will do whatever the Chinese government tells them to do. I worked with one factory, and over a beer in the evening, he was basically saying that if the government told him to sell his whole factory to them for just $1, then that's exactly what he would do. There is a huge culture of stepping in line with exactly what the government says and never challenging that. But that basically means if you're working with a Chinese manufacturer, then you are effectively dependent entirely upon what the Chinese government says. The open door policy in a lot of these factories is also really worth considering. So yeah, it's great if you're over there and they're really welcoming and they show you around and everything else, but how many of other people's confidential products are you then seeing? And what happens next week when you've gone home and they're showing someone else around and it's your product that's on the production line? And this open door policy doesn't just extend to Western visitors. This is also about kind of auditors and inspectors and their friends and everyone else. I'm always surprised about how many different people I often see being shown around Chinese factories, particularly when a lot of the projects are confidential and sensitive. Now, another hugely surprising thing that I've come across is that actually there's very little legal recourse if something goes wrong. At the end of the day, the court system in China will always find in favour of the Chinese company, and so if something goes wrong, there really is very little you can do. You are operating really based on trust and your relationship with that manufacturer. You can't rely on the legal system to protect you in any way. Now, another thing that I find hugely shocking is that often what the factories will do is produce, say, 1,000 units for you, and they'll just produce an extra 500, and they'll view that as fine, and they'll go and sell those 500 locally on the Chinese equivalent of eBay, or maybe they've got a distributor in Taiwan or another country in the Far East, and they'll just shift those extra 500 units and view that as a good opportunity to make a little bit of additional profit. By the time they've bought in all the materials and the components for your product and they've set up the production line, it's very little extra cost for them to just make those additional units and then see if they can sell those and make a bit of profit. Now, that may or may not be a problem. It is certainly a violation of your intellectual property and your rights to your product. If you're not selling into those other countries where they're offloading these products, then maybe you're not too worried about it. But it does happen surprisingly often, and at the end of the day, how are you even going to know that they're doing it? Now, so far this video has been very negative, and let's be really clear, I am still manufacturing products in China and still recommending that my clients manufacture in China as well. So before we talk about the positives, do check out the description below. There's a link to a really good PDF guide that I've written, Manufacturing 101. Get your copy today, link in the description below. So what are the positives about making in China? Well, the supply chain's fantastic. They've got suppliers for basically everything over there, often locally to your assembly factory. A lot of the motors and batteries and all that kind of stuff are made over there in the first place, and therefore it's a lot easier for them to get hold of that type of thing to put into your product. Cost is a massive advantage, and let's be clear, it's not half the cost to manufacture in China I've worked on products where actually it's a tenth of the cost to manufacture it in China as opposed to over here in the UK. And that cost saving is not to be sniffed at. I often find that our Chinese manufacturing partners are so much quicker to respond than manufacturers in the EU and in the UK as well. Sometimes I can find that actually I had a sample made by a Chinese factory and air freighted over before I've even got a response from a UK factory about whether they would quote for making something. And this responsiveness from the Chinese does mean that actually it's hugely easier and quicker often to manufacture on the other side of the world. But that is a huge shame, and it does come with the risks that we've talked about. Now, I've saved the most shocking story about Chinese manufacturing companies till last. Just before I share that, if you want some support finding the right manufacturer, whether that's in China or over here, or getting your product ready for manufacture, then check out my company. There's a link in the description below. You can book a call with one of my experienced design team about how we can help with your project. So we had a particular product that we were working on with a client, and it needed a chromate conversion coating. Now that might sound a bit technical, but basically it's a kind of iridescent yellowy green coating that you often get on metal parts, and it stops the metal corroding. Now we try and avoid it because actually the EU with the REACH regulations desperately try to stop manufacturers using the manufacturing process for this coating because it's highly carcinogenic. It uses lots of toxic chemicals, and it is a huge issue. Now with this particular product we couldn't avoid it, and I was out in China doing a bit of a sourcing exercise with our client, and we walked into a room within this Chinese factory, and there were two workers who were doing this coating process, and they were both covered in this iridescent yellow-green coating material. And it was just awful. This is something that would never be allowed to be used in the EU without safety goggles and full-on protective kit. Certainly would never be allowed to come in contact with any bare skin, and yet these two workers were covered in it. Now we were outraged, and we challenged the factory owner on this, and his only response was, "It's okay, we get different workers in 6 months." We could not believe it. That is just outrageous. And so obviously, we walked out and refused to do any business with that factory at all. So here are my 3 tips to make sure that you avoid working with the wrong manufacturers in China, because there are some really good factories out there, and I have some great friends actually out there now who are factory owners who do a really good job and look after their workers, but you have to find the right manufacturers to work with. So point 1, try and find a recommended manufacturer. Someone who is referred to you, who has made products for someone else for many years and they've never had any major problems. Those referrals count for a huge amount. Point 2, always check out your manufacturer. If you can't personally visit, and that is the best way, then do use an independent auditor to check out the factory and provide you with a report, ideally with photographic and video evidence like walkthroughs, to make sure as much as you possibly can that is an ethical manufacturer for you to work with. Thirdly, always get a written contract about what they're going to produce and by when and for what cost, with signed off gold samples. Don't do it on a verbal agreement. Inevitably that will lead to problems. You've got to have something in writing, and any factory that isn't happy with that process, then you should avoid like the plague. By following those 3 tips, you should have a successful experience in China. More information is available in the PDF I mentioned earlier, which is linked in the description. So there you have it, the shocking truth about Chinese manufacturing companies. Do check out this video next, which gives you essential information on why the best factories will never make your product. I'll see you in the next video.